I was excited to embark on a road trip with my closest friends. We had planned this trip for months, and I couldn't wait to hit the open road. Our destination was a cabin in the woods that we had rented for the weekend. We loaded up the car with snacks, drinks, and our overnight bags and set off on our journey. As we drove deeper into the night, I noticed that our GPS was acting strangely. It kept telling us to take a turn that didn't seem to exist, and the estimated arrival time kept getting later and later. Eventually, we found ourselves on a deserted road that we didn't recognize, and the GPS instructed us to turn onto it. The road was dark and eerie, and there were no streetlights to guide our way. As we drove further, we came across a sign that read "Welcome to Eastwood." The sign was faded and covered in cobwebs, and the town itself looked like it had been abandoned for years. We decided to explore the town, thinking it would be a fun and spooky adventure. The silence was overwhelming, and the only sound we heard was our footsteps crunching on the gravel. The houses were all boarded up, and the windows were covered in dust and grime. Suddenly, we heard a faint whisper. We couldn't make out what it was saying, but it sounded like it was coming from behind us. We turned around, but there was no one there. As we continued to walk, the whispering grew louder. It was like a chorus of voices, all speaking at once. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I knew that something wasn't right. We heard footsteps behind us, and we quickened our pace, thinking that it was just our imaginations. But the footsteps grew louder and faster, and I knew that someone or something was chasing us. As we walked down the deserted streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It was so quiet, almost too quiet. The only sound was the crunch of our footsteps on the gravel road. The buildings around us were old and decrepit, their windows boarded up and doors locked tight. It was as if the town had been frozen in time, abandoned and forgotten. Suddenly, I heard a faint whisper coming from one of the buildings. I turned to my friends, but they hadn't heard anything. I brushed it off as my imagination, and we continued walking. But the whispering grew louder and more distinct, and soon we all heard it. We followed the sound to a small house on the outskirts of town. The door was slightly ajar, and we could hear the whispers coming from inside. Without thinking, we pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was dark and musty, and we could barely make out the shapes of furniture and objects in the dim light. But we could hear the whispers growing louder and more frantic. Suddenly, a figure stepped out of the shadows. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt. She was wearing a long white dress that looked like it had been torn and stained with blood. Her eyes were sunken and dark, and she had a look of terror on her face. We tried to speak to her, but she didn't respond. Instead, she just kept repeating the same words over and over again. "Don't stay here. You have to leave. It's not safe." Suddenly, we heard a loud banging coming from the back of the house. It sounded like someone was trying to break down the door. The woman's eyes widened with fear, and she grabbed our arms, urging us to leave. We ran out of the house as fast as we could, back into the quiet, deserted streets. But the banging continued, getting louder and more violent. We realized that we weren't alone in the town, and that someone or something was trying to keep us there. As we ran, we heard more whispers and footsteps behind us. It was as if the whole town was alive with ghosts and spirits, all trying to trap us there. We ran as fast as we could, but we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. As we got back into the car and drove away, we realized that we had made a grave mistake by taking that shortcut. The whispers and ghostly apparitions followed us, haunting us for days afterwards. I don't know what happened in that town or why it was abandoned, but I know that I never want to go back there again. The memory of those whispers and ghostly apparitions still haunts me to this day. That night still haunts me, and I can't help but wonder what would have happened if we had stayed in Eastwood. I will never forget the ghostly whispers and the feeling of being watched by something evil. It was a night that I wish I could forget, but it will always be burned into my memory. Now let's hop onto story number 2, but before I begin reading, make sure that you have subscribed to Mr. Scare for regular horror podcasts. I was driving through a remote area in the middle of the night, trying to make it to my destination before sunrise. The winding road was surrounded by dense woods, with no signs of civilization in sight. I had been on the road for hours, and fatigue was starting to take its toll on me. That's when I saw her. A young woman, standing by the side of the road with her thumb out, looking for a ride. I slowed down and pulled over, feeling a twinge of guilt for leaving her out here in the middle of nowhere. "Hey there," I said as she climbed into the passenger seat. "Where are you headed?" "Anywhere but here," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I tried to make small talk, but she remained silent and distant, staring straight ahead. Her pale skin and dark eyes gave her an otherworldly appearance. I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. As we drove, I noticed that the road was becoming more and more treacherous. The trees loomed closer, casting ominous shadows across the road. The air grew colder, and a dense fog began to settle in. I asked the woman if she knew where we were going, but she remained silent. Suddenly, she pointed to a turnoff up ahead. "Turn here," she said, her voice barely audible. I hesitated, but something about her tone made me obey. As we turned onto the narrow, winding road, I felt a sense of dread wash over me. It was like we were driving into a trap. The road grew narrower and more treacherous as we went, with steep cliffs dropping off on either side. The woman remained silent, her gaze fixed ahead. I tried to turn back, but the road had disappeared behind us, replaced by an impenetrable fog. That's when I saw them. A group of ghostly figures, standing in the middle of the road. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, and their faces were twisted into grotesque masks of pain and suffering. I tried to swerve around them, but they seemed to be everywhere, surrounding us on all sides. The woman beside me suddenly let out a blood-curdling scream. I turned to her in horror, only to find that her face had changed. Her eyes were now dark pits, and her skin had taken on an unearthly pallor. I realized then that she was not a hitchhiker at all, but a ghostly apparition. The car began to shake violently, as if it was being torn apart. The ghostly figures closed in, their twisted hands reaching for me. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder and turned to see the woman's ghostly face inches from mine. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, I looked back to find no one there. I looked up at the rearview mirror to see if I could catch a glimpse of the hitchhiker again, but there was no one there. My heart raced as I realized that he had vanished into thin air. I tried to calm myself down, thinking it might have just been my imagination playing tricks on me, but I knew deep down that it was real. I drove for what felt like hours, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of the hitchhiker or any other potential danger. But the road ahead was empty, the only light coming from my headlights. Suddenly, I heard a loud thud, and the car started to shake violently. I swerved to the side of the road and got out to see what had happened. To my horror, I saw that one of my tires had burst, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. I was about to call for help when I heard a voice behind me. It was the hitchhiker, and he was laughing. "You thought you could escape, didn't you?" he said, his eyes gleaming in the darkness. I froze, unable to move or speak. I was trapped, alone with this deranged spirit. The hitchhiker circled around me, his laughter growing louder and more sinister. I could feel his cold breath on my neck as he whispered in my ear. "You're mine now. You'll never leave this place." I closed my eyes and tried to block out the horror, and I kept driving for my life. I never looked back. My brain had stopped processing anything and everything that was happening. I don't remember how I got out of that horrific situation. But I never drove that road again, and I never picked up a hitchhiker again. The memory of that night still haunts me to this day. I've been driving for hours, trying to make it to my destination before the sun comes up. But the dense forest around me seems to go on forever. The only sounds are the hum of my engine and the rustling of leaves in the wind. Suddenly, I hear something else. A low growl coming from the trees on my left. I glance over, but I can't see anything in the darkness. I try to brush it off as my imagination, but then I hear it again. This time it's closer. My heart starts pounding as I realize that something is following me. I press on the accelerator, hoping to outrun whatever it is, but I can hear the growls getting louder and more frequent. Then, I see them. A pack of wolves running alongside my car. But these aren't normal wolves. They're massive, with fur as black as night and eyes that seem to glow in the darkness. I try to speed up, but they match my pace effortlessly. I can hear their claws scratching against the asphalt as they get closer and closer. I'm panicking now, frantically trying to think of a way out. And that's when I see a sign for a small town up ahead. I don't know if it's my best option, but I don't have any other choice. I veer off the road and into the town, hoping to lose the wolves in the maze of streets. The town is deserted. The only sounds are the creaking of old signs and the howling of the wind. I drive through the empty streets, trying to find a way out. But no matter which turn I take, the wolves are still there, hot on my tail. I can feel their hot breath on my neck as I race down the main street. And then, I see a figure up ahead. A man, standing in the middle of the road, waving his arms frantically. I slow down, hoping he can help me. But as I get closer, I realize that something is off about him. His eyes are glowing, just like the wolves. I slam on the brakes, but it's too late. The man leaps onto my car and starts pounding on the windshield. I can see his teeth, sharp and glistening in the moonlight. I don't know how I managed to do it, but I hit the gas and peel out of the town, leaving the wolves and a strange man behind. As I frantically tried to find my way out of the forest, the howls of the werewolves grew louder and more frequent. They seemed to be getting closer with every passing second, and I knew that I had to find a way to protect myself. Suddenly, I saw a small cabin up ahead, and I quickly pulled over and ran inside, slamming the door shut behind me. The cabin was old and musty, with cobwebs covering the corners of the room. There was a small fire burning in the fireplace, but other than that, the room was empty. I knew I couldn't stay here for long, as the werewolves would surely find me eventually. I needed to come up with a plan, and fast. As I paced back and forth, I noticed a book on the table. It was old and worn, with the title Werewolf Lore printed on the cover. I quickly flipped through the pages, hoping to find some useful information. According to the book, there were only a few ways to kill a werewolf, with silver, decapitation, or fire. I didn't have any silver on me, and I wasn't about to try to decapitate a werewolf, so fire was my only option. I quickly gathered some kindling and set it alight, hoping that the smoke would keep the werewolves at bay. As the fire grew bigger, I heard a loud banging on the door. The werewolves had found me. I grabbed a torch and waited by the door, ready to defend myself. As the door burst open, I saw the snarling faces of the werewolves. With a quick swipe, I set them ablaze, watching as they howled in agony and retreated back into the darkness. I knew that I couldn't stay in the cabin forever, so I quickly gathered my things and got back in my car. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, and I knew that I would never forget this terrifying encounter with the supernatural. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know if it was real or if it was all in my head. But I do know one thing: I'll never forget the fear and panic that consumed me as I drove through that dark, lonely forest. I've always been fascinated by the paranormal, so when my group of friends suggested a haunted road trip, I was all in. We planned out our route, marking all the stops along the way where we could potentially encounter ghosts, spirits, or other supernatural entities. Our first stop was an abandoned mental asylum on the outskirts of town. We parked our car outside the decaying building and made our way inside. As we explored the creepy hallways, we heard unexplained sounds and felt sudden drops in temperature. But that was just the beginning. Our next stop was an old cemetery that was rumored to be haunted by the ghost of a murdered woman. As we walked among the gravestones, we heard whispers in the wind and saw shadowy figures moving among the trees. Despite the unnerving experiences, we pushed on to our next destination, an abandoned hotel that had been the site of a brutal murder-suicide. As we walked through the silent corridors, we felt an oppressive sense of dread that made it difficult to breathe. But things really took a turn for the worse when we arrived at our final stop, an isolated stretch of road that was said to be haunted by a vengeful ghost. As we drove down the deserted road, we heard strange noises and saw flickering lights in the distance. Suddenly, our car's engine died, leaving us stranded in the middle of the haunted road. We tried to start the engine again, but it wouldn't budge. That's when we heard a ghostly voice whispering our names from outside the car. Panic set in as we realized that we were completely surrounded by spirits. We could see their ghostly forms pressing against the car windows, reaching out for us. We were trapped. Thankfully, after multiple attempts, the engine roared back to life. As we drove away, I could feel a strange energy in the air, as if the spirits of the dead were watching us. We stopped at an old cemetery, where we got out and walked around the headstones. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, and every sound seemed to make me jump. As we drove away, I saw a figure standing by one of the graves. I couldn't make out who it was, but I had the feeling that they were staring right at me. We continued our journey, visiting other haunted locations, but the sense of unease continued to grow. At our final destination, an abandoned hospital, we decided to split up and explore the building alone. I wandered through the dark, eerie corridors, feeling as if I was being watched by unseen eyes. Suddenly, I heard a faint whispering voice, as if someone was trying to communicate with me. I followed the voice to a room at the end of the hall, where I found a group of people gathered around a Ouija board. They invited me to join them, and before I knew it, I was asking questions to the spirits that had apparently possessed the board. But then, the atmosphere in the room suddenly changed. The temperature dropped, and I felt a cold breeze on the back of my neck. The board spelled out a chilling message: "You should not have come here." That's when I saw them, shadowy figures lurking in the corners of the room. They started to move closer, and I realized that we had awakened something sinister. We tried to run, but the door was locked from the outside, trapping us inside. As the ghostly figures closed in, we huddled together in fear. That's when we saw her, the ghost of a young woman, her face twisted in rage and hatred. She had come for us, and there was no escape. I don't remember much of what happened next, but I do remember the screams and the feeling of being dragged down into darkness. When I woke up, I was lying on the ground outside. My friends were nowhere to be seen. I got up and ran, not daring to look back. I never spoke of what happened that night, but I never forgot it either. I learned that some things are better left alone, and that there are some places where even the bravest of souls should never venture. I was driving home from work, tired and ready to collapse into my bed. It was already midnight, and the roads were empty, except for my car. I turned on some music, trying to stay awake, but as I drove, I couldn't help but feel like something was off. There were strange shadows moving around me, darting in and out of the corners of my eyes. I tried to shake it off, thinking it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me, but the feeling persisted. Suddenly, I saw a figure appear in the middle of the road, illuminated by my headlights. I slammed on my brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. As I came to a stop, the figure disappeared, leaving me alone in the dark. I tried to rationalize what I had seen, thinking it was just a trick of the light, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. As I continued to drive, the shadows grew more prominent, and I saw more and more figures appearing on the side of the road. They looked like people, but their features were indistinct, their faces twisted and blurred. I felt like I was driving through a nightmare, and I couldn't escape it. Suddenly, I saw a woman appear on the side of the road, her face pale and her eyes empty. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. She seemed to be beckoning me, urging me to follow her. Without thinking, I turned off the main road and followed her into the darkness. As I drove, I realized that I had no idea where I was. The road had become narrower, and the trees were thicker, blocking out the moonlight. I saw more and more figures appearing in the shadows, their eyes following me as I drove past them. I felt like I was being watched, like they were all waiting for something. Finally, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was the woman I had seen earlier, her eyes fixed on me. I tried to swerve to avoid her, but she disappeared, and I heard a sickening thud as my car hit something. I slammed on my brakes and got out, my heart racing as I saw what I had hit. It was a woman, her body twisted and broken. She looked like the woman I had seen on the side of the road, but her eyes were open now, staring at me accusingly. I felt sick to my stomach, realizing that I had just killed someone. But then, I saw her body start to fade away, and I heard the whispers of the other figures around me. They were congratulating me, praising me for what I had done. I realized then that I was not being haunted by a ghost, but that I was the ghost, the one that had been waiting for this moment for years. I was the one who had died on this road, and now I was doomed to haunt it forever, waiting for someone to take my place. The figures around me were all ghosts like me, waiting for their turn to be set free. And now, I had become one of them.